Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar discussion with Dr. Michael Auslin about his new book, National Treasure: How the Declaration of Independence Made America. I'm Elliott Drago, the resident historian and manager of network engagement at the Jack Miller Center, a nonpartisan educational venture committed to solving the crisis of uninformed citizenship by teaching America's founding principles and history. The Jack Miller Center has three central objectives: build and empower a movement of scholars who are focused on civic literacy, forge new models in university-based preparation of K-12 civics and history teachers, and grow the national coalition of civic education leaders, practitioners, and funders for a renaissance of civic awareness and purpose. Learn more at jackmillercenter.org. Today, we're speaking with the award-winning scholar, Dr. Michael Auslin, whose new book, National Treasure: How the Declaration of Independence Made America, reveals that the Declaration of Independence is not just a foundational text, but a document with a long and complex afterlife. The Declaration's meaning has been shaped not only by the founders, but by generations of Americans and others who have debated, preserved, and repurposed it. In National Treasure, Dr. Auslin invites readers to see the Declaration anew, tracing its journey through history and showing how its significance has evolved. In doing so, he challenges us to rethink what this iconic document has meant and what it continues to mean today. Dr. Auslin is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Prior to that, he was an associate professor of history at Yale. He wrote National Treasure as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress's John W. Kluge Center and an American Heritage Partners Fellow at the Society of the Cincinnati's American Revolution Institute. He writes a Substack, the Potomac Packet, on Washington, D.C., past and present, and lives in Virginia. Dr. Auslin, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Elliott. I appreciate it and look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So let's start with what drew you to the project. What inspired you to write a book about the Declaration of Independence?
Well, there's two answers. I guess every author has a different, entry point. For me, one was that I had spent most of my career looking at America abroad, trying to understand our history, our values, our interests in the rest of the world, and in my case, particularly Asia. And maybe at some point you just want to come home. You just feel that it's time to start understanding it at home as much as you tried to understand across the seas and outside our borders. So that was one sort of push that just got me more interested in trying to figure out where we've come to as a nation. I think secondly, then drawing from that, I started looking at a project on Washington, D.C., where I live. Washington, D.C. in the 20th century, really, how did it become the imperial capital? It doesn't pop up, right? It has to be built and it has to be conceived, and you have to have these social networks and the like. And part of that's urban history. So I went down to the National Archives to just try to understand that important building and federal triangle a little bit better. Was talking with the then archivist and hearing all these stories about the Declaration. I didn't know anything, shockingly and embarrassingly. Mm-hmm. So I went down to the bookstore. I just wanted to buy a book on the Declaration. They didn't have one. They didn't have just a general history of us and the Declaration, the Americans and the Declaration. And that, there have been books, obviously, but nothing that I really wanted to read. And so that sort of kicked me off and started me going. And it was about 2 years ago, so I knew we were heading towards the 250th. So I thought, it's now or never.
Excellent. So that origin story is helpful. And so let's zoom out to the field itself. How have historians tended to write about the Declaration, and how did those earlier approaches shape the way you wrote your book?
As I mentioned, there have obviously been a lot of books on the Declaration, not as much on the Declaration as there has been on the Constitution in terms of analysis and of course the legal debates and the like. But of course we've had lots of books. Most of them have focused on the 1776 revolutionary period, right? They focused on the drafting. They focused on who influenced Jefferson and how the document. Some of them have looked at how the document was put together, and you think particularly here of people like Pauline Mayer's American Scripture, Danielle Allen's Our Declaration. Those are the two most really recent broad-based ones. A lot of them have been I would say not in any negative way, of course, but they've been a little bit more academic. They've been written by professors with a very analytical and critical eye, and that's, I think, very important. There's also been a completely separate world of the conservators and the archivists writing not exactly for themselves, but more for people within that community, explaining what they've done to preserve the document over time. These groups don't really meet all together that much, but no one that I had found had written a serious, comprehensive, soup to nuts history of the Declaration from 1776 to today. Really, to be honest, the type of thing I wanted my parents to read. And so my approach wasn't to rewrite, the wheel, so to speak. It wasn't to, as Thomas Jefferson said, it wasn't to uncover things that had never been said before, but it was to put it in a narrative that really explained our relationship to the Declaration, and in a sense, then, American history through this document and its lives. So there are in the book what I talk about. Maybe we'll get into this just very briefly, though. The difference between how I approached it and others, 3 declarations. The first is what I call the relic, and that's really has been the world of the conservators and the archivists. Why has the engrossed Declaration survived to this day physically? It's a fascinating story. The second declaration is the symbol. That's the thing that Danielle Allen talks about, or Pauline May, or Gary Wills, or Carl Becker. How did the Declaration become and evolve as the great symbol of the American ideal? And the third declaration is one that most people haven't even looked at, and which I, in some ways, found the most fascinating. And that was the Declaration as cultural object. In fact, you see behind me 3 different printings of the Declaration. Right? None of those are original, right? We print them today and we buy them. And that's really sort of what I was trying to get at, was the idea that we've made the Declaration into this unique cultural object on T-shirts and ball caps and the like. And we can talk about this more, but it serves as a bridge between the relic and the symbol. And so that's really how I structured the book. And I think that's what makes it different from others who've approached the subject.
Excellent. Yeah. So thinking about how others may have interpreted the Declaration or written about the interpretation or written about the Declaration, your framework really stands out. And as you alluded to, the Declaration has 3 lives in your mind. So maybe we can unpack this idea of the 3 lives a little bit more and talk about how these lives shape our understanding of the Declaration's place in American history.
Sure. Happy to. Well, I think I started with the relic. And partly I started with the relic because that's where it all came to me at the National Archives. I wasn't planning this for 10 years. I probably should have been, but I wasn't planning it for 10 years. And so it was talking to the archivists and the conservators that really launched me off on a material history. And what I thought, by the way, is that initially I would just do a short, really quick and dirty book, 40,000 words, let's say, on why the parchment still exists. Because I just think it's interesting, as someone who's done a lot of cultural history, material elements are central to cultural history, at least in my view. And so I thought, I'll just do a quick book on that. And then it eventually expanded, and I wound up writing 3 40,000 word books and putting them together into one, right? Relic, symbol, and object. But it starts with the relic. And, by a lot of accounts, the relic shouldn't be here. It shouldn't have survived. It was terribly mistreated. It was almost burned multiple times. People didn't care about it for the first almost half century or so of its existence. There's no real reason why the document should have persisted. And of course, that's why when we go look at it today, it's in such terrible shape. Right next to it is the Constitution, which is in beautiful shape. You read every single word and every single signature on the Constitution in the National Archives. The Declaration, it sort of breaks your heart, right? You can barely see it. So the story of its survival and the slow recognition of the importance of the document physically as well as symbolically sort of feed together to make this race against time and to try to balance this question of, well, how do you preserve it, right? How do you keep it for posterity, but at the same time show it to people? And so I have chapters I call Into the Light and the People's Declaration about what we take for granted today, right? My parents took me to see it. I took my son to see it. Hopefully he'll take his children to see it. This document that sits in the National Archives, we take it for granted, and that's the end of a process whereby generations of Americans are trying to figure out, okay, can we hang it up on a wall? Should we do that? Where should it be? Who should control it? And then these questions of, well, what's happening to it? Why is it fading? And by the way, they were worried about it fading in 1840s, right? That's when it really begins, this concern. So it's been 100 and, almost 200 years of worrying about the fading. So then, they don't have the science of conservation or preservation. So there's this whole fascinating history of these steps by which we get to today's space age technology, with sapphire crystals and argon gas and lasers. It's Bond level stuff. But in the book, I trace how, the first thing they did was, well, let's sew it onto a piece of cardboard and hang it, because that's going to help preserve it from being rolled and unrolled. And today, the conservators react with horror, but back then they thought that was advanced. So that's really the story of the relic, and how it was saved from the British in 1814. It was put into Fort Knox in World War II. They built this fabulous atomic vault in the Cold War because we're worried about the A-bomb. All of that is really the history of the relic and why today we can see it. The second declaration, again, as I intimated, closely tied with this, is the symbol. It really wasn't the symbol of the American idea for a long time, for decades, as I had originally mentioned. It was something that in many ways was seen to have done its job on July 4th and in the weeks afterward, i.e. telling the world what had happened and telling Americans what had happened in Philadelphia, that they're part of a new nation. It's the first time this had ever happened. And then rightfully, the focus turns to governing. How are you going to govern? We have 13 years of pretty much failure under the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. And since then, it's all been about the Constitution. We still argue about the Constitution, as we should. It's the political battlefield to tell us how we're going to live together. But starting in around the beginning of the 1810s, so actually after 1814 and the British burning of Washington, the knowledge of the survival of the Declaration by the skin of its teeth, as well as the idea that for the second time in a generation, Americans had defeated the British, really gave new life to the document. And suddenly it began to be seen as something more than just a statement of grievances and an announcement of a new nation. It represented deeper yearnings. Now these, I would say, reached their apotheosis with Abraham Lincoln, and then sort of revitalized by Martin Luther King and others in civil rights. But you can go back to John Quincy Adams in the 1820s, talking about the importance of the Declaration as the symbol for what a constitutional republic is meant to be. And that develops over time and, of course, becomes central to every single debate we have. Now, those debates are often, and rightfully so, constitutional. But the spirit behind them is the Declaration. Again, if the Constitution tells us how we will live as a people, I think the Declaration tells us how we should want to live as a people. So if you're talking about civil rights for women, obviously abolition and slavery and the end of slavery and equal rights for Blacks, if you're talking about immigrants and the like, all of these debates are inherent in the document itself. So symbolically, it represents our greatest aspirations, our hopes for that more perfect union, as the Constitution puts it. But without the Declaration, I don't think we get onto the road to the Constitution. So that's the second declaration. And then to wrap it up, the third declaration is one that really fascinated me, again, as a cultural historian, is this cultural object. There's really no other document or statement of principles, if I can put it that way, that I can think of, that has become a cultural icon unto itself.
Right.
And first of all, part of it, of course, is the incredible phrases that Jefferson penned and the Congress, whipped into shape, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, right? And we've had endless recitations of these. So they're sort of burned into our hearts and our minds, and that's wonderful. But we've taken that and we've actually turned it into a physical relationship with this document that I think is very important. As I mentioned briefly, I think it serves as a bridge between the relic that survives in the National Archives and the symbol that's in our head. So if you look over our shoulders and you see these the two on either side are the original broadsides that were published, John Dunlap and then Mary Catherine Goddard, and behind me, of course, is the famous stone engraving, the facsimile that's really what we see when we see the document. But these were all newly printed. And in fact, last week at the University of Virginia, I printed my own Dunlap broadside. on an accurate reproduction 18th century press, and they made a plate from their Dunlap that was part of the Albert Small collection, and then we all got to ink it and put the beautiful paper in and press it, and I haven't hung it up yet, but we do that. We've been hanging these things up on our walls for 200 years, since the first facsimiles came about. And we stamped it onto medallions, and we've put it onto, you can't see, but above me on that bookshelf right next to me is a hat with "We hold these truths to be self-evident." John Trumbull made his famous portrait, on which it went onto the $2 bill, and it went onto calendars, and it went onto posters. We have brought the Declaration into our lives in so many ways that, it's sort of a rite of passage. You go to the National Archives or one of the national parks, and you buy that crinkly, antiqued, fake replica of the Declaration. You put it up on your bedroom wall. I had one, my son had one, we all have them. And I found the company that did that process. And I think it's a great story. It's this unique American amalgamation of civics and commerce. And you see these amazing advertisements where the Declaration is used to sell other goods. So that my favorite one is from 1876, the New York Advertiser, some merchant named G. Nicholson, whatever the G stands for, takes out this ad, bold type, it says, "Important, every purchaser of coal gets a Declaration of Independence."
Right.
Why? But why not, is
Right.
my point. And I love that it became this way of, yes, selling goods, but keeping the Declaration in front of us, and something that you can make very personal and pretend you're a little kid writing your own Declaration with that quill pen.
Yep.
And no one else really does that, and no one does it really with any other document. So I think the Declaration as object is a critical one that has really been overlooked, and one that again ensures that in some ways it remains a living element of our personal and communal and political experience.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the hallmarks and highlights of your book is the way that you weave these three lives together. So if we move from interpretation back to the moment itself in 1776, the story becomes much less unified than we sometimes assume. I mean, with so many different and at times conflicting ways of life across the colonies, how did the Declaration manage to bring them together under a shared purpose?
It's a great question, and there are arguments that it didn't or it couldn't fully. Right? John Adams himself, this is decades later, said that at the time of independence, 1/3 were in favor, 1/3 of Americans were opposed, and in good American fashion, 1/3 didn't know. So the Declaration, in part, was a document to force people to choose. Right? It followed by 2 days the vote on independence. So when the Declaration was adopted, we in the minds of the Continental Congress were already an independent nation. It never happened before, so it wasn't. There was a process for it, and there were hundreds of thousands of loyalists who considered themselves as American as anyone else, and probably at that point in time even more American because they weren't rebels. Right? They were loyal to the king and loyal to Great Britain, and tens of thousands of those left. They went to Britain, they went to Canada, they went to the British Caribbean, thinking of themselves as nothing other than Americans, but never, in most cases, to return home. So the Declaration certainly didn't sway them. And it may not even have honestly swayed those who really didn't have a view on the matter. But what it did do, in particular, George Washington felt it was critical for the army to hear this and to know that they were fighting for something. because of course, if they didn't fight, then the whole game was up. So you really had to use it as a way to unify the army. The state legislatures. Now, the vote for independence was unanimous. New York had to abstain and then came in a few days later when it got instructions, but the vote was unanimous. But even so, people still wanted reconciliation, many of them. And they, even if they wanted to be, as American as they could be, separated in terms of their own ways of governing themselves, they still wanted reconciliation, or they feared, rightfully so, a fight with the world's greatest power. So the Declaration was sent out to all of the state legislatures at this point. They were state congresses, state assemblies, none of them were legal in the eyes of the British, because the ones that were legal had all been abolished, or were told you can't vote for independence. And then these extra legal groupings all popped up. I mean, it really was very radical. This had no standing in parliamentary or common law in any way, other than that the Americans said, well, common law means we get our own assemblies, and you're trying to take that away. And then, but the British said, well, it's not legal if you're opposing the crown and opposing Parliament. So the Declaration was sent to them to keep them on side, so to speak, keep them on board with this whole project. Back then the roads are terrible, so it's sent off by post riders, and it takes weeks and months to actually get to some places. I think Savannah, Georgia, if I remember, is the last place that receives the Declaration. They don't even hear about independence until August. There's not as many newspapers in the South, by the way. So one way that this is spread, of course, is through newspapers, and there aren't newspapers as many in the South. And so word has to come from the dispatch riders. So it's read on town greens. It's read very much from the pulpit. A lot of not copycat, but copies of the broadside that John Dunlap printed on July 4th were reprinted in the colonies, what were now states, and sent to, you can see these, that's written on the back, to Pastor so-and-so or Preacher so-and-so or the like, Reverend so-and-so usually, right? And told to read at a certain time on Sunday. Sometimes they were read publicly in the square, as I said, and a lot of times they were read from the pulpit, because that's where you got people on Sundays. So these things are read in church, again, to tell people what's happening and to remind them that they're a new nation. And it's really when the Americans start winning the war, of course, that the belief in both independence and then the rightness of the Declaration really takes hold. But as I said, pretty quickly, independence is always celebrated through the Revolutionary War. There's fireworks and two drams of rum for the soldiers, Washington's orders, and all of these things. But the Declaration itself pretty quickly gets forgotten. Again, it was sort of seen to do its job at a certain point, and then events started taking over. So the Declaration sort of becomes a bystander to all of this. And I think what saves it is that precisely in the new country and in the new political process that's being developed, and that they are struggling their way ultimately towards the Constitution, the Declaration is not a political document. Of course it is, right, in terms of Britain and in terms of stating why we're leaving. But that was to the British. And to tell the Americans they were now citizens of a new country. But it says nothing about how we're to govern ourselves, explicitly so, right? That was a different committee, the Committee for the Articles of Confederation. So it is deeply influencing politics, especially as time goes on, but it's above politics, right? It can't be amended. It can't be repealed unless you end the country. So it just sort of is there. And I think that neutralizes it in a way that actually saves it. And then later it can be drawn upon again, not to say, well, we have to govern one way or another in the Constitution. That's going to be a separate argument. But it's that spirit that grows through the 19th century to say, well, these are the ideals of the spirit of 76 and the generation of 76. And probably the best exponent of that is Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. So the document does work in many ways in 76 and through the Revolutionary War, but its most important role comes later.
Right. So sticking with 1776, this distinction between deciding and declaring independence, it suggests that the document itself wasn't the final word. So let's turn to what it left unresolved. You write that, quote, the members of Congress knew that their declaration left much unsaid and unfinished, end quote. So what were some of the earliest signs, even within the founders' lifetimes, that realizing the Declaration's promises would require continued striving toward its principles?
Right from the beginning, the debate over Jefferson's draft. It has a long and impassioned condemnation of the slave trade. Now, not slavery itself per se, but of the slave trade. And Jefferson, of course, like most of the signers of the Declaration, deeply hoped that slavery would disappear of its own accord. That it was an inefficient system, it was an immoral system. They made no bones about that. George Mason says even those who were slaveholders, like Jefferson, like Mason, Richard Henry Lee, and others, they wanted the institution to go away. They didn't know how to do it. And of course, that became impossible in the 19th century as it became the staple crop, the labor of the staple crop of cotton and the like. But even in 76, when Jefferson writes that this is, an abhorrent and immoral trade that is forced upon us by the king, that's taken out by Congress. It's taken out by Southern slaveholding interests, particularly Georgia and South Carolina. But the North is making money off of slavery as well, in terms of products, in terms of the trade itself. And so Jefferson called it mutilations that were done to his draft, right, to change it. But that was the very beginning. And the hypocrisy was understood. It was something that they were not able to deal with if they wanted to have a unanimity among the colonies in order to be free. The British, of course, understand this as a wedge issue. They promise freedom to slaves who revolt and join the British to fight the Americans. This is something that they fear deep, and they fear deeply, of course, in the South. But slavery is through the entire colonial system. It's up in the North. It's different. It's not plantation slavery or tobacco field slavery, which is primarily what it was in 76. But it was household slavery. They're deeply worried about slave uprisings, and that, of course, is a fear that just grows, through the 18th and 19th centuries. But they know that this is, as Jefferson calls it, a sleeping serpent, right? That's going to eventually wake up and strike them in the breast, and that its poison could kill the nation. But they have no way of solving it, and of course, the Declaration quickly becomes, as I mentioned, sort of bypassed or overtaken. And then you have the whole debate in the Constitution, and you wind up with the infamous 3/5 clause in the Constitution that showed that they still didn't know how to do it. And the Constitution, by the way, allows the abolition of the slave trade after a period of 20 years. Or what it really allows is Congress to take a position on it after 20 years, which Congress does in 1808. It outlaws the slave trade. But by then, there's a domestic slave market that is massive and basically supplants the trade. So they are working towards what they think is politically possible. And I think the greatness of the Declaration is that it foreshadows much of this. Of course, there's still a debate, an academic debate. All men, what does that mean? Does it really mean all human beings, including women and blacks and Indians and the like, or was it more narrow? And I think the debate is important, but the result is much more important, in that it's incontestable today what it means, because we've made it mean that. And so the greatness of the Declaration, I think, is its capaciousness to expand over time in a way that was not seen as contradictory by most. I mean, the Confederacy, the South are making different arguments, but as we go through history, our history, what takes root and holds is this idea that, yes, it does mean all are equal, which I believe the founders did believe, but they didn't believe it in a political environment. What they believed is that all all men, all people are children of God. They all have inherent natural rights that cannot be taken away from them. But in a political system, there's a difference of who has power and who's allowed to have power. And then the debate on slavery gets, and then the debate on women get in that. But as we move into deep into the 19th century, then there's less and less contradiction. Yeah, yes, we fight a civil war, and civil rights in that respect for women don't happen until the early 20th century. But it's continually referred to and deepens its hold on ever wider segments of our society. And that I think is the greatness of the Declaration. It's no one pretends that we began life as a perfect nation, but as a self-correcting democratic constitutional republic, we were breaking new ground in every way. We weren't the first to abolish slavery. The British did in the empire a few decades before us, and they didn't have to fight a war. We are grounded in the history that shaped us. You couldn't, use a magic wand to get rid of slavery. But the arguments consistently move towards that expansion. And I think that's what's important. And how from the beginning there was hope, and that hope eventually turned into action.
Right. And that's one of the more, inspiring parts of your book, this idea that the Declaration has always been a resource for change. And so let's address that issue head on. So why has the Declaration of Independence served as a powerful touchstone for reform, seeking equality from abolition to civil rights?
I think there's a couple of different reasons. One is that it has these phrases which are eternal, and they're inspiring, and they speak, as Lincoln said, to the better angels of our nature, that we truly want, almost all of us, to live in that type of world, because it means all of us are equal, regardless of our beliefs, our backgrounds, our abilities. We're all equal as members of a political community, which is how we live. We live in political communities. And so we're all equal. And so it's as President Ford said on the occasion of the bicentennial, the Declaration is our Polaris, the fixed star of freedom, because it expresses truths that are eternal. It's unchangeable. Mm-hmm. And I think, first of all, that's incredibly powerful. And enlightenment of us as humans and as political humans has been an ongoing process since the Babylonian codes of law, right? It's been thousands of years. And we are so much better off than where we were before, if not yet perfect. But our Declaration is one of the tiniest handful of documents that expresses in the most beautiful and powerful language those human aspirations, what truly makes us human. But I think there's also another element to it that isn't discussed quite as much. There is I'd say there's a tendency these days to view the Declaration somewhat in the way that you phrased it, which is, this instrument for reform. And I'm saying you did this, but if you frame it that way, then you start basically from this constancy of inequality and imperfection. And of course, obviously, we recognize we're not perfect and that there are still lots of inequalities. But that's different, I think, from the historical experience of what many, I would probably argue most Americans felt, which is that this country was living up in ever increasing ways to its ethos, the ethos of the Declaration. And the reason the Declaration could be successful for reform is because the American experiment was a success.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Meaning if the nation was, as some would like us to believe, illegitimate and flawed and immoral from the very beginning, I don't think it would have survived. And why would people have continued to come here if it was such a terrible place? I mean, it's sort of an Occam's razor argument. The nation did succeed. Was it perfect? Of course not. But that's, as Gordon Wood reminds us, it's unhistorical to expect the past to think like us at any stage, right? So 1865, when the issues finally settled, They didn't think as they did in 1776. And in 1965, 64, 65, when the Civil Rights Bill is passed, we weren't thinking like they did in 1865. So Wood's argument, is, as always, is a touchstone for us to remember that history is this evolving, ongoing process. But I think, again, if the experiment had been completely illegitimate from the start, then it wouldn't have succeeded. But because it was succeeding, giving people a better life, allowing people to determine their destiny, drawing people from around the globe because they said it's a lot better than where I am, then it was seen as more legitimate to tackle these much deeper, harder questions. But if you didn't have what was, to use a colloquialism, a going concern, then you might not have been able to get to those deeper questions. Now, of course, our great failure was the Civil War, and that is why to this day we debate it and we're fascinated with it, because it was the one truly irreconcilable moment in our history. Nothing else comes close, not anything that's happening today or anything at any other point in time. And part of that's, of course, because of another side of the Declaration, a side that we all accept, but that in the antebellum era was used by the South, which is, of course, to justify what they were doing, which is, of course, to say government by consent of the governed. And so their arguments were, well, our way of life is what we believe is right. And if the broader federal government no longer allows us to live that way, and of course their fear is that slavery is going to be blocked in the rest of the country and then chipped away at in the South, then we no longer give our consent. And even Northern newspapers are accepting this argument up until the Civil War, but they're saying you can't leave by force. It has to be an agreement, meaning the North would have to say, okay, you go your own way, we'll go our way. So this is the flip side, right? Is that the Declaration is appealed to most eloquently by Lincoln, but it's also appealed to by Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens and other Confederate thinkers, saying, is not the whole point of 76 that we no longer consented to the British style of government and we wanted our own? So this was our one truly irreconcilable moment. And the horrific tragedy, which scars us still, which we argue over still, we saw it flare up most recently in 2020 with the George Floyd riots, when all of a sudden Confederate statues that had been up for several generations were torn down. This was a reliving of the arguments of the past, of the 19th century, that shows that will be with us forever. But America did not stay where it was in 1860, 1861. We are a completely and utterly different country, a country where all men are created equal and where we've lived up to those rights. So I think that the Declaration succeeded ultimately because America succeeded. And it's just gained in strength and power since then, as immigrants have come by the tens and tens of millions to this country to take part in it. And no questions, of course, that women should have equal rights and the like. But all of that was because people saw that there was inherent good here and inherent good in the country. Living up to it is messy and difficult because we're humans, but he did do it.
Right. So let's talk about the role that the Declaration played in the 20th century. You described the Declaration as becoming a Cold War icon. How did this transformation occur? And at the second part of the question, I think you have alluded to it, the idea that part of this transformation is within the Declaration of Independence is having a broader reach, a global reach. So how did the Declaration become this Cold War icon? And at the same time, what features of the Declaration allowed it to resonate globally?
Well, to the second question, it began resonating globally in the 18th century, actually, with the French Revolution, and then, of course, with the early 19th century revolution. So it has a long history of this. And this is a topic that a lot of historians are focusing very heavily on right now. The global influence of the Declaration, as well as the global impact of the revolution. And I think that's very right. I think at times it has served to draw us away from the focus on the Declaration at home and why it's so important that it continued to be a force for both reform, but also, and this is critical, this is, I guess, what I should have said in the last question, and what I do think is absolutely critical, it is a force for unity. So let me just emphasize that for one quick second. When Frederick Douglass is talking about the Declaration, and when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are talking about the Declaration, they are not using it to separate from America. They are using it to become full participants in America. They see it, as I see it, as a unity document. And again, to get a little political sciencey for just a second, usually the two claims that are in the document that are argued or adjudicated are the equality claim, all men are created equal, and the liberty claim, consent of the governed or whatever you have. That these are the two sides, and often they're in some tension, right? If you have all equality, you may take away liberty of some people. And if you give people full liberty, they may not treat all as equal, right? So there's tension. I think the founders saw it, and Jefferson certainly did, as two sides of the same coin. But I actually think above that is an umbrella of unity. It's the unity of the one people that is referenced in the very first line, not a people or 13 colonies, the one people. It's also why the founders pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. They were unified in what they saw as a covenant among themselves and between themselves and God. God is referenced in the document multiple times, more than Jefferson initially put in. Congress throws in a few more gods just to be on the safe side, right? Pascal's wager, right? So it's smart.
Right.
But the unity element, to me, is what truly makes the Declaration so powerful through our history. Yes, we look at it as this instrument of reform, but why have reform? You have reform because people want to be fully part of this community, equal, but unified. So that's what I think is so critical about this. It's how I try to express what the document is a unity document. And so the focus on the Declaration abroad, I think, is very important, but I don't want it to detract from why it's so critical at home as a document that through our history continues to create unity across the country as the country's expanding and changing dramatically, demographically, industrially, through urbanization and the like. So that's how I'd answer part of your question. The second question is that it is an icon, obviously, in the Civil War for Lincoln. It becomes an icon. I think it becomes very self-consciously used in the late 18th, particularly late 19th, particularly early 20th century, to turn immigrants into Americans. I think that's a critical element of it. Translations and civics handbooks and the like, to make people say or understand that this is your patrimony as well now if you've come here. But it becomes a real icon, of course, when America strides onto the world stage. World War I, it's there, and I talk about it, but really I think comes to the fore in World War II, that this is why we're fighting. I mean, we do say this in World War I, but it's a much briefer period. It's more concentrated, and America is not the greatest power in World War I, but of course we are in World War II. And so it becomes this icon, and it's repeatedly invoked in World War II. This is why we're fighting fascism. This is why we're fighting the Nazis. Franklin Roosevelt says it. Newspaper columnists say it, and I try to give as much of that as I can in the book. And then there is this unexpected, unwanted, but fairly seamless transition into the Cold War. Nobody wants a Cold War. Everybody wants Uncle Joe to be our friend, but it's not going to happen. And so suddenly there's this new and very, very complicated competition and struggle with the Soviet Union. It's one thing, and it's a terrible thing, to be at war. But being at war is very clear. You're either going to win or you're going to lose. What was this Cold War? How do you win a Cold War? The last thing you wanted to do, because of nuclear weapons, of course, was actually fight. So you had to struggle in different ways, fight in different ways, and triumph in different ways. And so I think that, of course, as powerful a symbol as the Declaration was in World War II, it was, I think, or maybe I'm just more interested in the Cold War, I think it was more powerful in the Cold War because it's so much longer. Right. It's not 4 years, it's 40 years. right? And so it is this beacon as to why we're doing what we're doing in the Cold War, where the Iron Curtain has come down, and totalitarianism and communism are is directly antithetical to what the Declaration and our system stands for: individual rights, right? The right of property, the right of self-government. Ironically, of course, the Soviets and everyone else who's under communist rule claim they're equal. Everyone's equal under communism. You're just not free. And so the spirit of the Declaration is what's critical. Ho Chi Minh starts the 1945 Vietnamese Declaration of Independence against the French by quoting our Declaration verbatim in certain parts. But he certainly doesn't have the spirit behind it. And so it's that spirit that carries us through. And there's a physical element. This is part of the relic and the cultural object, which I loved. I actually love talking about this in the book because it's the era that I grew up in, not the early Cold War, the later Cold War. We grew up in it. And first was the enshrinement in the National Archives. Now, it had been enshrined in the Library of Congress, was very important, but the old setup in the archives, which frankly, I mourn that it's gone. I understand why, but it's gone, was extraordinarily powerful. And I get a little detailed on it in the book, looking at the structure of that old shrine on the back wall of the rotunda, where everything comes into a center on the Declaration in this altar within the shrine. Underneath an eagle, next to the flags and the columns, it was up, elevated on the wall. And so it was our secular 10 Commandments. There's no question. And that can lead to, mindless idolatry, but it also was unbelievably powerful to see as a child, and to fill you with excitement and dread at the same time, because it was so strong. That's been gone since 2001, when they took it down and then they reopened in 2003 with it all on the floor. It is more accessible. You get much closer to it now. Everyone can see it better, but a lot of the power has been lost. But I think through the Cold War, the fact that it was almost as if everything that America stood for throughout the entire land, from sea to shining sea, sort of came to this one point, this one cynosure on the wall there. And that was an incredibly powerful object. And then secondly, behind me, this one in the middle, it was during this period that the mass production and mass selling of the Declaration, it had happened before, but at this level, never to this level, was everywhere. That's by the thousands and tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of copies. It went up in every school. It went up in churches. It went up in libraries. It went up in city halls. Everywhere you looked was the one sheet of the Declaration. It wasn't the Constitution. And I'm actually struck, this probably reveals too much, but watching older TV shows, you get them all on streaming now, and you can watch these great TV shows from the 50s, the old ones. The number of times I see the Declaration in the background, just sitting there. Right. But it is there, and you see it, and you know what it is. It's in an episode of Superman from the 1950s. It's in Wyatt Earp from the 1950s. But it's there. And so it was always in front of people's minds. And it was used explicitly. Again, you are the inheritors of 76. Right. They gave their lives for you, as one famous magazine article wrote, and I put in the book. And now it's your turn. And it's your responsibility. And so I think through those 40 years, to keep us unified and keep us focused, the Declaration played a truly unique role. Not to mention, by the way, also in this period is the Civil Rights Movement, living up to the promissory note, as Dr. King put it, of the Declaration, became part of that. And so all of it, I think, it flows together. And why, again, I think the Declaration is and remains our central document.
Excellent. So let's stick with the Declaration as a physical artifact. It's had many homes over the course of its history, as you've alluded to. And I'd like you to maybe identify or explain your favorite example of a custody dispute
Mm.
over the location of the Declaration, perhaps maybe a Philadelphia-related custody dispute.
Yeah. Oh, just since you're giving the hint. Yeah, I was gonna pick that because it actually has, as they would say, what do they call today? Like multiplayer games or something like that. Anyway, it has multiple players and multiple levels.
Yeah.
And to start off with, it's a weird question. Who owns the Declaration? Well, we the people own the Declaration, but somebody has to have physical custody of it and decide how it's going to be displayed. Until 1789, the Declaration was held by Congress, the Continental and then the Confederation Congress. Or as my colleague Jack Rakoff puts it, it's just the Congress. It's not, you don't distinguish between the two. So they held it. And then it's turned over to the Department of State. And the Department of State holds it physically holds it, literally rolled up in storage in an attic until 1841. And then they send it to the patent office, which back then was part of state, to display it to the people. Again, what I call coming into the light. It's there with brief interruption I talk about in the book. Don't want to give too much away, but it's there until 1876. And in 1876, on the centennial, it goes up to Philadelphia. And there's a whole debate over whether it can be sent to Philadelphia. Should it be sent to Philadelphia? And the organizers of the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition want to put it in Independence Hall. It's really a sort of brilliant move. Bring it back to where it was born and sort of recreate that moment. The government thinks, well, we'll send it to Philadelphia. We're just going to we're going to put it in the government building, which would have been much less effective. And so the Philadelphians went out. They convince the federal government, send it up. We have a safe, put it in there. It'll be okay. And it stays in there through the entire exposition. Millions of people see it. There's no turnstiles. We don't know. But 9 million people went to the exposition.
Wow.
And, hundreds of thousands, but almost certainly millions went to Independence Hall to see it. It's taken out and read on July 4th. The second time the original scroll had been read from. And then it goes back in its vault in Independence Hall, and it sits there. And the Philadelphians don't send it back to Washington. But what's going on in Washington is a different debate. So the first debate is the Philadelphians sort of think, well, maybe we can keep it. It should be here, right? Born here, we should keep it here. And then back in Washington, the Interior Department is fighting with the State Department. Why? Because the patent office in whose building it had been kept had been transferred to the Interior Department in, I forget the date. Somebody will know, and it's either the late 1840s or 70s. I have to look that up. I forgot the date. But anyway, the patent office is no longer under the State Department. But the Declaration's still in the patent office. And so just over time, as they say prescriptively, the Declaration is seen as the property, so to speak, of the Interior Department until 1876, when the State Department says, we want it back. And the Interior Department believes it's theirs, and the State Department writes up legal memorandum saying, no, this is why it's ours. And the Interior Department writes back different ones saying, no, we've had it for so long, it's really ours, like possession, 9/10 of the law. Meanwhile, the Philadelphians in their city councils, I guess they had two councils, passed resolutions saying, no, it really should stay here with us. Because if you send it back to Washington and you put it in the State Department, because State Department has this new building they want to put it in, it's safer, it's more fireproof, nobody's going to see it. So you've got these different levels. And cutting through all of it is Ulysses S. Grant, president, powerful, blunt former soldier and head of all the Union armies, finally sends this terse message and says, send it back to the State Department. So the Philadelphians get the message, it's sent back, and then immediately the Interior Department, with this very apologetic note, blaming the Philadelphians, by the way, sends it to the State Department saying, well, we would have sent it earlier, but the Philadelphians didn't send it back to us. So here it is. And then it goes into the State Department. So that I think is the most initially interesting argument, because in 1841, when Daniel Webster sent it to the Patent Office, and again, Patent Office was part of State Department, but nobody argued that it shouldn't go there or it shouldn't be displayed. They just did it. But, a generation later, suddenly there's these questions of who has the right and who can protect it best. And so there's a different set of questions that go around it. And then there's two more changes of authority. One is to the Library of Congress in 1921, which is not even one that the library requests, but is done by the State Department. And then there is a final struggle and a tussle between the Library of Congress and the National Archives post World War II in the 1950s, but it stretches back to the 1930s when the National Archives building is completed. Mm-hmm. Herbert Hoover lays the cornerstone for the archives and says, this will be the repository of our great documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, both of which are in the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress, and particularly Librarian of Congress Herbert Putnam, who is a far-seeing genius without question, but has no intention of giving it back. And he's citing congressional language to say that, well, what Congress really meant is that it's permanently going to be here. And so they have to wait until he's gone. Then they get sidetracked by World War II. And then finally in 52, it's fairly amicably settled, but there's still questions, and there's a lot of unhappiness on the part of the library, which is understandable, that this was taken from them and it was put into the National Archives. But it was equally embarrassing that the rotunda of the National Archives was empty for over 15 years from when it had been completed. It's supposed to be in there. So today you walk in, that's the main thing. But until 1952, the rotunda is essentially empty. Like they put exhibits in just to fill the space, but it's supposed to have this, and it doesn't. So I just, that's again part of the history of our document, that our founding document, that people don't talk about as much, which I just find fascinating. It's just a window into our bureaucratic history and our institutional history, but also it shows how important the Declaration remained and became even more so over time. And one thing I'll have to say for all of the ghosts that we were talking about, they all had the best intentions, all of them, even the Philadelphians. Even they said, "Look, keep it here, and everyone will see it because they're all coming to coming to Independence Hall, and that's the way it should be." But everyone in Washington had good intentions. What's best for the document and the people? And if you'll let me, I'll just give an answer that I think I do. I have this in the book in a way. It's just not as explicit as this. The justifying reason that is used at every stage, 1841, 1876, 1921, and 1952, every transfer of the Declaration, the justifying reason is fascinating. It's one word: fire. At each stage, there's a new building that can better protect it against fire.
Yep.
And that's, but it shows how over time it became so important that they knew it had to be protected. And the ones who gave it up often gave it up by saying there's a better building. And so we're not going to keep it in the State Department anymore back in 1841 or State Department in 1921. So
right.
I just love that part of it makes the Declaration's history very human to me. And I think that's a wonderful thing. We always talk about it in these exalted philosophical, political terms, which we should. But there's a very human history to the document. And I would argue for many Americans, it's that human history that may interest them even more than, was it John Locke or Francis Hutchinson who inspired Thomas Jefferson?
Right.
More. That's a critical question. Don't get me wrong. There's also these other questions about how we take care of our past, how we are custodians of our past, and what it says about us. And that, in many ways, is the history of the document. And I really wish I had written exactly that in the book. I didn't, but at least I can say it to you.
You can say it now, right? It'll be in part 2. So
the director's cut,
the director's cut, yeah.
The director's cut out there.
Declaration
600 pages long, but that's okay.
Space, yeah. It'll be all right, yeah. So given everything that the Declaration has been through, its travels, relocations, disputes over custody, all types of glue, It raises the question, as you've mentioned, right, of how it's actually been preserved. And the document has undergone numerous conservation efforts, some more successful than others. So, for those of us who are unfamiliar with the preservation of historical documents, what aspects of that process did you find most surprising?
Yeah, I found the process itself over time, meaning the learning curve, fascinating. It's not something that I knew, but again, as I mentioned, I started off at the National Archives, and that's their job, and they do an amazing job at it. If they have anything to say about it, the Declaration will be here in another 250 years.
Hmm.
Um, but they inherited from the Library of Congress, which did the first really scientific attempts to preserve it, and they inherited from the Department of State, which was struggling to figure out, okay, how do we keep this thing from deteriorating? So some of it, as I mentioned early, does sort of horrify you. Certainly horrifies conservators today. You can still see little tiny holes along some of the edges of the Declaration where it was threaded through to tie it to the first backing, so they could hang it up in the what was called the National Museum in the Patent Office in 1841. But they didn't understand anything about how, animal skin, in a sense, a living material reacts to humidity, to temperature, to the like. And so that's part of what really hurt it, is it's expanding and contracting, but it's tied down, so it's cracking. Of course, they didn't really understand sunlight fading it, which it was hanging in at least diffused sunlight in the patent office. And there's blue ribbon commissions to try to figure out how to save it. And thank God they were very conservative. They get these suggestions that, well, I'm a great calligrapher. Let me retrace over the whole document. And it's horrifying because it just would have destroyed the document. Another one wanted to put acid on it to supposedly bring the ink back to life. And, luckily there were a couple of blue ribbon commissions in the late 1800s, and they said no. So they did preserve it. And then you get, the use of glass, new types of glass and filters, and then the use of gas. So sealed cases, which come up first in 1951. It's still in the library, and it's put into its first really good case. Earlier cases, it sort of, cinched it down and, a couple layers of glass and the like. But here they tried to flush out the oxygen and put in helium gas. And so they did that. And then that was transferred to the National Archives in 1952. And then in 2001, they took it out again because they saw that not that the Declaration or the Constitution was degrading, but that the glass was starting to crack. And so they spent millions of dollars over years to create the most technologically advanced encasements ever. They had engineering firms, they had physics, you had chemists, and it's amazing. They make their own paper for the backing. The glass is specially made by Libby Owens Corning, which did it both in 1951 and in 2003. It's titanium, and it's carbon backings, carbon base holdings, nickel plated. Now they use argon gas. They shoot lasers through sapphire window openings so they can measure humidity. They're able to flush gas out. They keep it at a constant temperature and a constant humidity. It's absolutely fascinating what they do for this. And when I went to the British Museum a few years ago, they have one of the early Magna Cartas, not the earliest, I think that's in Lincoln Cathedral. And I wanted to ask, and I didn't at the time, I just wasn't as clued in, but now I want to ask, well, how special is this case? Because it's a lot of cases in the British Museum. I'm sorry, this is the British Library, not the museum, the British Library. And it just sort of looks like it's sitting there. But our cases, as we know, they're lowered into bomb-proof vaults, and they have sensors all over them. And of course, if you believe, National Treasure, the movie, then, they've got the heat sensors, which will set off an alarm. But it's really incredible, the technological expertise and the money that we're willing to spend to ensure that this lives forever. And so I just thought that the story of preservation, which is not something I knew very well, was really interesting for people to know. And again, it makes it a very human story. It's not just the words. We do share symbols and we share physical relics. Some scholars think we shouldn't venerate the relic as much because it detracts us from the meaning. But I think the meaning is enhanced when you see this parchment, which is sort of a time machine. It brings us back to the moment of our founding. It brings us back to the men who actually drafted it and thought about it and argued over it and signed it. And that to me is incredible that it still exists. And we're doing everything we can to ensure that it exists for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren.
Right. So these preservation efforts are just more examples of the richness of the Declaration's history. So let's end here by stepping back a bit. So how does your research on the Declaration shed light on America's founding principles and history? And I think that's an especially important and relevant question, given that Americans are preparing to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So what lessons from your scholarship might help citizens reflect on the meaning of the American experiment? And what does the Declaration tell us, this history of the Declaration, these 3 lives of the Declaration? How do those lives shed light on America's founding principles and history?
Well, I think that it's this is sort of the great goal that we have. Certainly what you do so wonderfully and critically at the Jack Miller Center in terms of keeping the principles alive, of sharing them with students of all ages and teachers who are going to teach those students and scholars like myself. I mean, that really is the point of all of it is that we don't survive as a self-governing people unless we understand how to self-govern. And I think we learn how to self-govern from the documents because they haven't been superseded. And again, as I mentioned, the Declaration is not a governing document, but it shapes everything that comes after it. And without it, I don't think we have our governing documents in the same way. And so for me, the Declaration, I think the story of its passage, its adoption, and those fraught days of July 76, June and July 76, is one of, in many ways, compromise. And, that's an art that in some ways we seem to be losing today. It was compromise that actually got it through Congress, which means it wasn't perfect. But it also was not lowest common denominator. It didn't say nothing. It said very important things, but it also didn't say certain things. And as I said, I think the greatness of the document is that its silences could be filled in later. But the document itself was powerful enough to bring us to that later point and still have relevance. And so the compromise of the Committee of Five, the compromise of Congress in editing it, quite frankly, the compromise it's over independence itself, where colonies that weren't sure ultimately went along with those who were sure, or individuals who were opposed stayed away, like John Dickinson on the vote on July 2nd. They compromised in ways to give the experiment a chance because they felt that ultimately it was important. And even if someone like Dickinson felt it was the wrong time for it, but he knew it was going to happen. So would he be one who would stop it from happening? He said no. So he compromised. And then secondly, with the document, what I think its lesson to us is, and I tried to talk about this a little bit, is unity. I didn't start off with that. That was not how I started the book, by thinking, oh, this is a unity document. But that's what I came to as I read through it for my own purposes. And the unity is what I really think is critical. I mean, again, you can't have a nation if you're not united. We learned that in the Civil War. And there are many who fear today over our sense of disunity. And I think if you go back to our first principles in the Declaration, that what they tell us are how we should want to live together. And we then express that through more concrete documents, right? The Constitution, how we will live together. But the unity is essential. And within unity was why the Congress voted unanimously. They could have voted, 8-4, 8-5, but they knew that could be fatal. You had to be And at the Civil War, for Lincoln, that was the point: is we must not break the bonds of affection between us, as he put it in his first inaugural address. We must remain united. We didn't, and unity was imposed, but that unity endured. It doesn't always, and in our case, it did. And I think it endured because at base was this apple of gold, again, as Lincoln called the Declaration, with these principles that all are equal, all are free. To paraphrase Daniel Webster, liberty and equality, now and forever, one and inseparable. That's really what I think the Declaration gives us. And so in this semi-quincentennial year, I hope we go back to the Declaration, not because it's a magic wand. It doesn't solve everything, but it tells us why we're together and how we should think about going forward in terms of being together. And from that perspective, even the grievances remain important, overwrought as some of them are. They tell us how a government shouldn't act, and that's as important as telling us how a government should act. So the Declaration, I think, still has enormous continuing relevance for us. And I think if we spent some time on it, then what I hope it would instill is, again, through its one people and its pledging to each other references, that civic assimilation is what is really critical. We can disagree, we always do, but it must be done in a way that maintains civility, that maintains the bonds of affection between citizens, that says that we will debate and ultimately decide how we will govern ourselves. Or, as this goes all the way back to Aristotle and his concept of civic friendship, which is very simple. It's the essence of democracy: ruling and being ruled in turn. That's about as simple as it gets, which tells you why you shouldn't abuse power when you're in power, because one day you'll be out of power and others will abuse power if you have. But citizens too, why you should not attack each other, cancel each other, veto each other, because we have to live here together. And that's where I think the Declaration is most important, and what I hope people focus on in this Jubilee year.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Auslin, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Thank you to the JMC communications team. What a terrific conversation. I encourage all of you to go out. Oh, it's being blurred. It's being blurred. Oh, I encourage all of you to go out and pre-order your own copy of National Treasure. Buy a copy for your friend or family. This is, a generational book here. If you liked this webinar and you want to learn more about the Jack Miller Center and how we support the teaching of America's founding principles and history, I encourage you to visit our website, which is jackmillercenter.org, and sign up for our email list. A special thanks to donors at the Jack Miller Center who make these programs possible. To support our work, please visit jackmillercenter.org. Once again, Dr. Auslin, thank you for your time.
Thank you.